You were always going to end up here. Not because you made bad choices. Not because you didn't work hard enough. You were always going to end up here because the debt was never designed to disappear. It was designed to keep you moving. You take out a loan for college because everyone said you had to. You get a credit card because rent came early and the paycheck came late. You finance a car because the city you live in was built for cars, not people. You sign a mortgage because paying rent for 30 years means you own nothing, but paying a bank for 30 years means you might. And in every single one of these moments, you were told the same thing. This is how you build a future. This is how you get ahead. This is temporary. But it never feels temporary. The minimum payment becomes a constant. The interest keeps compiling. And you start to realize that the finish line keeps moving further away the faster you run toward it. This is not personal failure. This is design. In this video, you'll understand why debt is not a tool for building wealth but a mechanism for extracting it. You'll see who benefits every time you make a payment. You'll learn why the system survives every crisis, every collapse, every revolution. And you'll understand why it never actually changes, no matter who's in charge. Because debt is not a bug in the system. It is the system. Here's what most people miss. They think debt is a financial arrangement. You borrow money, you pay it back, you move on. But debt is not just about money. It's about time. It's about behavior. It's about control. When you owe money, you don't just owe a number. You owe future labor. You owe compliance. You owe predictability. The debt doesn't care if you're tired. It doesn't care if you're sick. It doesn't care if the world falls apart around you. It comes due. And that predictability is what makes debt the most powerful tool ever created for organizing human behavior. Let's go deeper. The modern debt system doesn't start with your credit card. It starts in the 13th century, in the Italian city-states, where merchants realized something revolutionary. You don't need to own the gold. You just need to control the paper that promises the gold. They created bonds, contracts, instruments of future payment. And they realized that the person holding the bond doesn't want the debt to be paid off quickly. They want the interest. They want the payments to continue as long as possible. Because the payments are the profit. This is where it begins. The separation between the loan and the goal. The borrower thinks they're buying time to build something. A business. A home. A future. But the lender knows the truth. The loan is not a bridge to independence. The loan is the product. The debt itself is what's being sold. And once you understand that, everything changes. Here's the part most people miss. Debt doesn't just extract wealth from individuals. It transforms entire societies. When a government goes into debt, it's not borrowing from its own people. It's borrowing from a small group of institutions that now have a claim on the country's future tax revenue. Every road that gets built, every school that gets funded, every war that gets fought, it all gets financed with debt. And the people who hold that debt don't want it paid off. They want it rolled over, extended, refinanced. Because every time the debt is renewed, the terms get renegotiated. The interest gets recalculated. The control gets deeper. This is how empires stop being empires. Not because they collapse, but because they transfer ownership of themselves to their creditors. Rome didn't fall to barbarians first. It fell to debt first. The empire became so indebted to its own military, its own provinces, its own bankers, that it could no longer function as a sovereign entity. The collapse came later, but the transfer of power happened silently, through contracts, through bonds, through promises of future payment. Spain didn't lose its empire because it ran out of gold. It lost it because it borrowed against the gold it hadn't mined yet. It sold future silver from South America to German and Italian bankers before the ships even left the harbor. By the time the gold arrived, it already belonged to someone else. France didn't have a revolution because people were hungry. It had a revolution because the monarchy was bankrupt, and the bankers who held the debt demanded tax reform that would destroy the aristocracy. The revolution was not the beginning. It was the result. And here's what makes this so powerful. The debt doesn't care about ideology. It doesn't care if you're a king or a commune. It doesn't care if you're capitalist or communist. The debt persists across every system because the debt is the system. The Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of debt. Not to Western banks, but to its own impossible promises. It promised housing, healthcare, education, security, all without a pricing mechanism to allocate resources. The result was a system drowning in unpayable obligations. The debt was social, not financial, but it was still debt. And it still transferred power. Let's bring this back to you. You're not living in 13th century Florence. You're not managing the treasury of Habsburg Spain. but you're inside the same structure. Every month, a portion of your paycheck disappears before you even see it. Taxes, insurance, loan payments, subscriptions. You didn't agree to most of this individually. You were born into it. You inherited a system where participation requires debt. And the system is very good at making you feel like this is normal. Like this is just how life works. You go to school, you get a job, you take on debt, you pay it off slowly, and if you do everything right, maybe you get to retire. But here's the trick. The system doesn't need everyone to retire. It needs everyone to keep working. It needs you to stay in the cycle. Because the moment you stop participating, the moment you stop paying, the system loses a piece of its fuel. This is where the real control appears. The system doesn't control you with chains. It controls you with obligations. You can't quit your job because you have a mortgage. You can't move because you have a car payment. You can't take a risk because you have student loans. You can't protest too loudly because you have a credit score. And all of this is framed as responsibility, as adulthood, as maturity. But responsibility to what? To a system that needs you more than you need it? Here's the truth they don't say out loud. The economy doesn't run on production anymore. It runs on debt. The largest financial institutions in the world don't make money by building things. They make money by lending money, by packaging debt, by selling it, by betting on it. In 2008, the global financial system nearly collapsed. Not because people stopped working, not because factories shut down, but because the debt, the mortgage-backed securities, the credit default swaps, the derivatives built on top of derivatives, became too complex, too interconnected, too fragile. And what happened? Did the system learn? Did it reform? The central banks created more debt. They bailed out the institutions that caused the crisis by lending them money at near-zero interest rates. They called it quantitative easing. They called it stimulus. But what it really was this: the transfer of public debt to private hands. The people who caused the collapse were rewarded. The people who lost their homes, their savings, their futures, they were told to be patient, to work harder, to adapt. And the debt grew larger. This is not a bug. This is the design. Because here's what happens when debt becomes too large to pay. It doesn't disappear. It gets restructured. It gets transferred. It gets absorbed into the next generation. Your government is in debt. Your city is in debt. Your schools are in debt. And now, so are you. And the people who hold that debt, the bondholders, the investors, the institutions, they don't need to control the government directly. They just need to make sure the debt keeps getting paid. Because every payment is a transfer of power. Every interest payment is a claim on future labor. This is why austerity always follows crisis. Not because there's no money, but because the debt must be paid first. Before healthcare, before education, before infrastructure, the debt comes first. And when people protest, when they demand change, the answer is always the same. We can't afford it. We're in debt. We have obligations. But obligations to whom? Here's where it gets darker. The system doesn't just survive crises. It uses them. Every financial crisis creates an opportunity for consolidation. The small banks fail. The big banks buy them. The small businesses close. The big corporations expand. The homeowners default. The investment firms buy the houses. Wealth doesn't disappear during a crisis. It moves. And debt is the mechanism that moves it. When you default on a loan, you lose the asset. But the lender gains it. When a country defaults on its debt, it loses sovereignty. But the creditors gain control over its policies, its resources, its future. This has happened over and over again. Argentina, Venezuela, Jamaica, nations that borrowed heavily and then found themselves unable to pay. And when they couldn't pay, the International Monetary Fund stepped in with new loans, but only if the country agreed to restructure its economy, cut public spending, privatize state assets, open markets to foreign investors. The debt was never about the money. It was about the power to redesign society. And it works the same way on a personal level. When you're in debt, you lose options. You lose flexibility. You lose the ability to say no. You stay in jobs you hate because you need the paycheck. You tolerate conditions you shouldn't tolerate because you can't afford to be unemployed. You make decisions based not on what you want, but on what you owe. And the system depends on this. It needs you to be just stable enough to keep paying, but never secure enough to stop. This is why wage growth has stagnated for 50 years while productivity has exploded. This is why housing costs have skyrocketed while incomes have flatlined. This is why healthcare, education, and childcare have become unaffordable for the middle class. Because the goal was never to create widespread prosperity. The goal was to create widespread dependency. Debt is the tool. Dependency is the result. Let's go even deeper. There's a reason why debt is tied to morality. Why we use the same word, debt, to describe both financial obligation and moral obligation. Why we say someone owes us, even when no money is involved. Why we talk about paying for our sins. Because debt is not just an economic tool. It's a psychological one. The moment you owe something, you carry guilt. You carry shame. You carry the feeling that you are behind, that you are failing, that you are less than. And this feeling is useful. Because it makes you compliant. It makes you work harder. It makes you accept things you otherwise wouldn't accept. The system doesn't need to oppress you with violence. It just needs to convince you that your suffering is your fault. That if you were smarter, more disciplined, more responsible, you wouldn't be in debt. But the truth is this. The system produces debt faster than it produces the money to pay it off. Think about it. Every dollar in circulation is created as debt. When a bank issues a loan, it creates money. But it doesn't create the interest. The interest has to come from somewhere else. From another loan. From another dollar that was also created as debt. This is why the money supply always has to grow. Because the debt always grows faster. And if the money supply doesn't grow fast enough, someone defaults. Someone loses. The system is designed so that there are always losers. And the winners are the ones who issue the debt. Here's the part that will make you uncomfortable. You are not in debt because you made bad decisions. You are in debt because the system requires you to be. If everyone paid off their debts tomorrow, the economy would collapse. Not because people would stop working, but because the financial system is built on the assumption that debt will continue. That payments will continue. That growth will continue. The stock market doesn't rise because companies are producing more value. It rises because they're borrowing more money to buy back their own shares. Real estate prices don't rise because homes are more useful. They rise because credit is cheap and buyers are willing to borrow more. Everything is built on future promises. On obligations that haven't been paid yet. On bets that tomorrow will be bigger than today. And the moment that growth stops, the moment people stop borrowing, the whole thing unravels. This is why central banks will do anything to keep debt flowing. Why interest rates drop to zero. Why money gets printed. Why bailouts happen. Not to save you. To save the system. Because if the debt stops, the power stops. Let's connect this to the bigger picture. Debt is not unique to capitalism. It existed under feudalism. It existed under mercantilism. It exists under socialism. Because debt is not an economic policy. It's a technology of control. Feudalism didn't end because people got tired of kings. It ended because the kings went into debt and lost control to the merchant class. The merchants didn't overthrow the system. They bought it. Colonialism wasn't driven by exploration. It was driven by debt. European empires borrowed massive sums to finance their wars, and they paid off those debts by extracting wealth from the colonies. The colonies weren't conquered for glory. They were conquered to service debt. And when colonialism ended, the debt didn't. It just changed form. The former colonies became independent nations, but they were born into debt. Debt to the World Bank. Debt to the IMF. Debt to their former colonizers. And that debt gave the lenders power over how those nations developed. What crops they grew. What resources they exported. What policies they adopted. This is neo-colonialism. And it runs on debt. Here's the pattern. Every time a system claims to be new, to be different, to be revolutionary, look at the debt. If the debt remains, the power remains. The Soviet Union claimed to abolish capitalism, but it still owed debts to Western banks. It still needed loans to finance its infrastructure. And when it couldn't pay, it collapsed. China opened its economy in the 1980s. But it didn't abolish debt. It embraced it. It became the world's largest creditor. And now, it uses debt to expand its influence across Africa, Asia, and Latin America through the Belt and Road Initiative. The system doesn't care what you call it. It only cares whether the debt continues. Now let's talk about your life. You were born into a world where housing requires debt. Where education requires debt. Where healthcare requires debt. Where starting a business requires debt. And you were told that this is opportunity. That this is access. That this is freedom. But freedom from what? And access to what? You have access to a loan. But the loan gives someone else access to your future income. You have the freedom to choose your debt. But you don't have the freedom to live without it. This is the illusion. The system offers you choices, but all the choices lead to the same place. Obligation, payment, compliance. And the longer you're in the system, the harder it is to imagine a life outside of it. Here's the existential question. What happens to a society when an entire generation realizes that they will never pay off their debt? That they will never own a home outright? That they will never retire? What happens when the promise breaks? Because the system depends on the promise. It depends on you believing that if you work hard enough, if you make the right choices, if you sacrifice enough, you'll eventually be free. But what happens when people stop believing? History shows us two possibilities. 1. The system restructures. Debts are forgiven. Wealth is redistributed. Power shifts. 2. The system doubles down. Austerity, surveillance, control. Both have happened before. Ancient societies had debt jubilees. Every few decades, all debts were forgiven. The slate was wiped clean. It wasn't mercy. It was survival. Because when debt became too great, societies collapsed into chaos. Modern societies don't forgive debt. They extend it. They refinance it. They make it inheritable. In some countries, student debt follows you to the grave. In others, it passes to your family. The system has decided that forgiveness is not an option. And this brings us to the final point. Debt was never meant to be paid off. It was meant to be permanent. Because permanent debt creates permanent control. The borrower is never free. The debtor is never sovereign. The obligated is never independent. And the system needs this. It needs a population that is always striving, always working, always one missed payment away from disaster. Because a secure population is a dangerous population. A population with nothing to lose is a population that can say no. But a population in debt? A population with a mortgage, a car payment, a credit card balance, a student loan? That population keeps working, keeps consuming, keeps participating, and the system survives. This is the truth they don't teach you in school. This is the truth that doesn't appear in economics textbooks. This is the truth that politicians will never say out loud. The system is not broken. It is designed to transfer power. And debt is the mechanism. So when you make your next payment, understand what you're really doing. You're not just paying back money. You're transferring power. You're giving someone else a claim on your time, your labor, your future. And they don't want you to finish paying. They want you to keep paying. Because the payment is the point. The system doesn't need you to believe in it. It only needs you to participate. And as long as you owe, you will.